We are now live with the December 15th edition of the NPM Feedback Triage meeting. We're joined today by two product managers from GitHub, myself, Miles Borns, and Brian Clark, and three members of the NPM CLI team. We've got Roy, Isaac, and Darcy. So we got a pretty full agenda today, so we're going to just jump right into it. We have a couple of high-level topics, and then we'll go through kind of like the backlog of things for the CLI because we got all the team with us today. So wanted to start with just a quick review of where we're at on package metadata. So if you were to go and look at the roadmap, and let me go ahead and just share my screen for a second here, if you bear with me. So here is our roadmap. And we can go and look at the project page for the roadmap. And we can see that we have a couple different things here left for the quarter around package metadata. We have the show download by versions and the show TypeScript information for packages that have type declarations. Unfortunately, the website and registry work is going to slip into early next. Oh wait. Yeah, the download by version, that's going to slip until early next quarter. There's still a little bit more work that we need to do. So you can see I just moved that over. For the TypeScript information, we are hoping to have the first iteration of that shipped before the end of the year. So that's still on track. So the next update that we have is improvements to 2FA and publishing and tokens. We had some small feedback around whoami tokens and some other bugs that were identified, which we've gone ahead and fixed. So really excited about that. And then we wanted to just do a really quick look at what we've got on the public roadmap for next quarter already, which is wrapping up the website and registry show download usage per versions. We're going to have the general availability of NPM 7 coming out. We're looking to open source docs.npmjs.com. We're going to be doing work to explore authentication with GitHub. We're doing work on expanding workspaces. That's a work item that we need to turn into more of an actual issue. It hasn't been expanded yet. We're going to do work on making the repo for a package more prominent on the landing page of the website. We're going to do a revisit of our policy for disputes and claiming abandoned packages, as well as an audit of packages that have shared names with Node.js. These are just the bits that we have right now, but there are more things longer term that we're going to be focusing on as well. And as we commit to those, that work internally as a team, we'll add more items to the roadmap itself. And so, now that we're done with kind of the really quick overview, we have a small backlog of discussions from the CLI that I wanted to get into. And we'll start here with make it easier to install a package from a pull request. This came from Gregor. When we first talked about it, I pointed out the fact that we can't actually install from a pull request now, which was a feature that landed in NPM 7. But then Gregor had a bit of an issue where he has a package that publishes out of dist directories. So it doesn't really fit with what we do today. Isaac had come in here and talked about ways to maybe install that could be a problem. And there was more discussion around a prepare script. But I think in general, what this comes down to is an issue whereby our existing install from a pull request functionality doesn't really work in mono repos or in repos that publish outside of the root directory. So I guess a quick question to the CLI team: Do we have any specific things related to this that we think we could work on?
Yeah. So there has been kind of some conversation around how to specify a path within a Git repo. I mean, ultimately, this is talking about installing a package from a pull request, but there's nothing magical about a pull request per se. It's just a particular reference in a Git repo. So it's a kind of a bigger question about how do we install from a folder other than the root of a Git repository, which I think is kind of where we're getting to with it. And that sort of, I think there was a suggestion sort of made in a different place somewhere. I think it was not actually like written up as an RFC, to do like some syntax to specify the path within the Git repo that you want to install. So it's still, you know, a little bit, it's a little bit tedious and like fiddly typing, but can totally be done. And then kind of once we have that facility to do that, it's not too hard to maybe talk about how to put shorthands around it.
Is this something we want to be supporting though? Because like it seems like also like there's two separate things going on here. Like when you're publishing a package, potentially there's steps that are being taken during that like publish step that potentially were like are not accommodated for when referencing like a
subfolder or something.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like it might be outside of the scope of like what we would support with the CLI and maybe better served as like a GitHub action or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's fair, I guess, but assuming that you have a repo with something under, you know, packages / my library, there's currently no way to install that Git repo. There's no way to install that module from the Git repository with npm today.
Yeah, I guess part of the question here as well is like, what is the use case of this? So like I could imagine Isaac, the install from a repo, but specify a folder solution solves a number of different cases, including, hey, I want to install a certain pull request, but it also is just like a general, hey, I can use this today. Like when I'm tracking a dependency, because some people do put Git repos in there rather than publishing to the registry for a number of different reasons, especially like if they're patching something. The pull request one, a lot of times where I think someone would want to install from a pull request is mostly like staging or testing a change before landing it. In which case, like this is also something that perhaps can be solved outside of the CLI through like kind of like staging of publication. That could either be something where like you're staging to the registry or staging to GitHub packages. Like in a world where it was easier to install GitHub packages from the npm CLI without having to do any explicit authentication, someone could make an action that just publishes to GitHub packages and gives you the link to install. So I just mentioned that more that there's a couple different ways to approach this problem, depending on like the I think the specific case here was around pull requests. So it may be good not to get distracted by the ways of improving Git dependencies, because while they are related, it's also somewhat different.
Yeah, the place where this has been requested a couple of times is, and the one that kind of comes to mind, the conversation we had previously was with Corey Farrell and a couple of other folks who work on Istanbul and NYC. And so Istanbul has all of its various libraries in this single mono repo. But there are things that use Istanbul that are not in that mono repo. And so in order to test, you know, a branch or something, maybe even before opening a PR, they'd like to be able to, you know, npm install Istanbul.js / Istanbul : path equals whatever or something like that. I don't remember the syntax exactly. It had to be a little bit wonky just to sort of not be backwards incompatible.
So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think like where we're getting with that, with this item right now, is there's like, you know, two potential things that we could explore here. One is improving how Git packages work, and the other is through kind of staging. But I think in either case, we're not really at the point where we can like consider this one answered.
No, the thing to do here would be to get it on the RFC agenda and write a request for comment for it and kind of explore it and make sure that we're not going to break anything else. it is a change to the npm package arg specifier module, which is always a little bit something we have to be a little bit careful about, because it's a very, it's a very simple module, but it's incredibly load bearing. There's a lot of stuff uses it to kind of make sure that we're always communicating about, we're always resolving to the right thing given some given dependency or command line argument.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and close this. And to those who are watching at home, if you have any interest in, working on some of these solutions, the RFC repo is definitely somewhere where we can kick off kind of scoping that work.
Mm-hmm.
So the next one that we have here, this is one that I have asked myself in the past. Add npm scripts as first level commands, such as npm dev. And there was an in-depth discussion here about, ones that we can maybe do and ones that we couldn't do, because some of these commands already exists and there could be breakages. But I think dev is one in particular that I think, a lot of people use. So I guess the question to the CLI team is, what's your philosophy here about this? And would you be open to making some of these commands like a top level command instead of having to include npm run?
So we had a discussion about this, about adding a default command config, which had some interesting conversation around it. And I think where we kind of landed is it's just a lot safer to make help search a little bit smarter than it currently is, rather than make the default command configurable. As far as adding specific ones, saying, well, okay, we're not going to make run just the default behavior like Yarn does, but there's a couple of commands that are extremely widely used. Let's go ahead and add those, like build or dev. The reason why, the reason for test, start, stop, and restart being on that list is simply that those were the only scripts that were, kind of user configurable in yinst, which was the package manager that I used a lot prior to writing npm. And then at some point somebody said, well, why can't I just run anything? And I thought, yeah, that does make sense. So we added the run script command, and sort of the rest is history. The one hazard is that if we did want, let's say we wanted to add a script called dev, if we ever want to add an npm dev command, now, okay, we've already kind of used up that that item in that namespace. But I think it's unlikely that we're going to create a new build or dev command. There was previously an npm build command in npm 6 and before, which was sort of only internally used. Now we no longer have that top level command, so it's perfectly fine to add it back as just an alias for npm run build. So yeah, I'm open to this. I think that it's not something that should kind of be done without some discussion, though.
All right, cool. So what would be the next steps then? Would it be starting an RFC specifically about those two commands, build and dev?
Yeah, and I would probably direct this conversation over to RFC 279, because that's kind of where the conversation's been happening. I'm not thrilled at the, we've also kind of talked about the prospect of like, oh, well, let's add like npr, which is sort of like to npm run what npx is to npm exec. I'm not super thrilled about that idea. I think that it very quickly spirals into like just sort of littering the namespace with a lot of different bins. It's easy enough to just put alias npr equals npm run in your bash RC or something.
You could say the same about it's easy enough to write, like just type run. So I mean, like I think the whole point is like making it easier to use npm, right, and to do these things, right?
Right. And the hazard of having a second bin is people need to know about it. It's kind of less discoverable. NPX has gotten, I think, enough attention over the years that it's been out that people do know about it, but compared with a top level command within npm, it just has much less sort of visibility.
Yeah, I'm guessing this would actually, something like NPR actually would argue would get picked up quite quickly, just because, and I'm a bit concerned by only privileging like 1 or 2 or 3 top level commands that map to scripts, because it doesn't map everything. So you're gonna always, and you're gonna end up with a situation where you're asking people to run scripts in 2 different ways. Because if we add dev and build, somebody eventually is going to have staging. Somebody's going to have another, expose or something that does something locally. So I think it kind of opens up the conversation to, well, why isn't my script eventually supported at the top level?
Right.
And then it sort of opens the floodgates again back to the conversation here, which is why not just default? And we've sort of default to that behavior, and we've had that discussion. We think that there's problems with it. So like that's the NPR discussion, I think, is something that could be brought back up here to try to bring it, to find a solution that works for everything.
I guess the only pushback I would give to that, Darcy, would, like, I had done some analysis when I was at Google using BigQuery, because I think, like, I would have to find where, but I think I had pushed for these changes as well. And like, if you actually crawl all of the package JSONs on GitHub and look at what like the top used commands are, build and dev are up there, not as much as like, start, obviously, or test. But it is fairly obvious that they are like significantly more used than all of the other ones. I could see the argument as like the slippery slope of we don't want to just keep using or keep adding over and over. Although I think the flip side is also that like at a certain point, if there's a certain like threshold of adoption, maybe we could come up with a number where it's like, hey, if this is used to a certain extent, perhaps it is then something that we could escalate. And it seems like, Isaac, you were just saying the baseline usage threshold could be a good way to measure that.
I find that tough. I feel like, because then you're still asking people to have 2 different ways of running scripts. And I think just standardizing off the, like trying to resolve this by standardizing the way you run scripts in a way for all your scripts, and pointing people to whether it's a new binary, like NPR as an example, then I think that's like, it solves the problem. I think, like, we can say that, it was weird back in the day that we supported like only a few of these commands and they have top level counterparts, but now, we recommend you use NPR or something like that. Again, this hasn't been proposed as RFC, so I don't want to keep speaking about it sort of at ambiguously.
Yeah, so I answered it in here, and I added that like perhaps we could lift some of them, but we don't have consensus. So perhaps we can move on to the next one, and if someone wants to pick this up and try to champion it, they can. Does anyone have any other last minute additions to this discussion, or are they kind of happy with where we're leaving it right now with like, hey, the RFC 279 is worth looking at, and if someone wanted to champion build and dev specifically, that could be its own RFC.
Yeah. I mean, just to be very clear, like RFC 279 is probably going to die a swift death here. Like it's, I threw it out there just because it's like, well, this would be really trivial to implement and people keep asking for it. Let's talk about it. But the kind of long-term ramifications are kind of bad. And the more that we explored it, the more clear it was like, this will do more harm to our community than good. And harm to our ability to just like, if we ever want to add a new command now for anything, we have to sort of scan the entire NPM registry, make sure nobody has a script by that name, because otherwise we're basically making a breaking change by adding that new command, right? We could just say, okay, well, every new command is a semver major, and there's a lot of integers out there, so whatever. but it's a pretty big shift from our previous, approach to adding new commands as being sort of semper minor.
Yeah, and I think I agree with protecting the top level namespace. I think maybe just I don't necessarily agree with a separate binary, but let's hash out the specifics at a future time. So the next one that we've got on here is support for groups of dependencies beyond just prod and dev. So this comes from Michael Hart. And he says, like, given how many dev-related tasks there are in large code bases these days, there are circumstances where installing all the dependencies in dev dependencies is overkill and only a subset as specific to the task you want to perform would suffice. One scenario where this is especially useful is if you split up your CI builds into parallel tasks, so each task doesn't need to install hundreds of megabytes of dependencies, such as formatting, linting, code generation, testing, deployment. And I can imagine for like CI, this is particularly useful. So this is an example that he suggested of creating dev dependencies and then having dependency groups where you could say, hey, for these specific groups, you only install this. I pointed towards this RFC on plugin dependencies, which was kind of about like scoping specific dependencies for specific plugins. Do folks have particular thoughts or ideas around this?
So the reason why plugin dependencies hasn't really moved forward is we've sort of been challenged to figure out the given the complexity of implementing it as the RFC proposes, we've struggled to sort of figure out what's the real use case there. Bin dependencies is also kind of in a kind of similar state. It's like it proposes a bunch of complexity around like how there's some different ways in how we resolve and reify dependencies, and it's not really clear what the use case is for it over just a regular dev or prod dependency. In this case, I think dependency groups, this is kind of an interesting idea. The challenge, I guess, would be, I mean, the implementation would be relatively straightforward, right? Because we would just basically say, if you've specified a dependency group, then when I'm building out the tree, I'm only going to add the dev deps that are in that group. One thing where it might get a little hairy is trying to figure out like, are there any missing dependencies when I run npm ls? And that could be a little bit tricky. Like now we kind of have this like, we have these kind of nice, easy, like 2 buckets, right? It's either dev or it's not. Now we have to also determine, is it dev? Is it required for anything that's on the linting group? And we've kind of changed this, we've gone from 0 to 1 to infinity, right? Now there's an arbitrary number of different dependency types.
So is this something that we should encourage Michael to explore in an RFC? Do we think that it could have legs, or do you think that it introduces too much complexity?
Yeah, I mean, I think, RFCs are relatively cheap. They're not as cheap as a feedback discussion, but yeah, we can kind of dig into it. It definitely has some interesting ramifications that we would need to definitely, chat about rather than just go off and implement it. But I think it's something that would be feasible to do a relatively short spike on and just kind of see how that feels. And if it's, go ahead.
Well, I think this is similar to, I've been looking at NX a lot lately, and they do labeling, and it's similar to this. And I can see the use case. We've also talked about workspace groups or aliases, and it's very similar to this as well, right? So So it might be good, as you say, Isaac, to do a spike or to talk about it more.
Okay, cool. Great. Answered. Lovely. Okay. Next. Make engines field usable with post install scripts. Currently have a package JSON with a post install script written in ESM and the following engines config. In Yarn, this results in an error while installing, clearly letting a user know that the 11.15.0 is not compatible and they should upgrade. In Node, it tries to execute the post install script first and never prints a warning about the invalid Node version.
I think I followed up on this. I think this might be just a mistake here. I believe the behavior is fixed, at least in npm7.
Oh, great. Then I will mark that as the answer. Easy peasy. Okay, lock file interrupt between npm 6 and 7. To ease the transition of people from 6 to 7, I think it'd be really useful that npm 7 knows a little bit about the new lock file version. From what I have experienced, v2 introduces a new package field. npm 6 could just ignore it. A new sorting algorithm for the dependencies. Isaac, you came in and talked about it, that is not intended to break 6. And we asked for additional questions, which we didn't get. I think like one thing that I've noticed, for example, and I've followed up with the Dependabot team, is if you try to run an npm install with npm 6 in a project that's using npm 7, it just creates massive churn because it removes whole sections.
Right, it removes the packages field.
Yeah. And then I think on the flip side, and I don't know if this has changed, running npm install with npm 7 in a package that has the package lock v1, that just like replaces the whole package lock right now, right?
So a lot of stuff won't change. Like you won't get an entire like, red, green diff. It'll update some things because the sorting algorithm is different. As I mentioned, it's using it's just using a different function to compare strings, using the built-in one instead of one that's sort of handwritten. But yeah, we could make npm 6 not warn about v2 and ignore and leave in place the packages field. The challenge with that is we could very easily, we could end up in a case where there's two things that are now out of date, that are out of sync. So if npm 6 is updating the dependencies field, but not updating the packages field, which it doesn't know how to do, and teaching it to know how to do that is, well, would be a lot of work. So it's like just removing the packages field is actually kind of the safest thing for npm 6 to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, I guess
7 will read from dependencies and it'll get everything it needs and it'll rebuild it the same way.
Yeah, so I guess like an answer could be here that like we recognize that they're churned, but like we're okay with that.
Yeah, or just the transition from 6 to 7 is as smooth as we can possibly make it. The transition from 7 to 6 is not going to completely break, but it's not going to be pretty. Like you're downgrading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the last comment here is what I would like is that when npm 6 is used to install dependencies with a lock file created with npm 7, it doesn't completely change the contents of the lock file. This is currently preventing me from testing npm 7 extensively in my projects. I guess there's also like, isn't there a command that you can pass to npm 7 to tell it not to update the lock file?
You mean npm 6? But yes, it's the same in either case. You can do --no-save.
And is that something that can be set via an environment variable?
Yes, all commands can be set by an environment variable. You do npm config save equals false. npm underscore config underscore save equals false. in the environment.
Is it no save, or what were you saying it was?
Yeah, no dash save. Yep.
Or dash dash save equals false, same thing.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself. So I think it's safe to say that, like, for now, this is likely the best solution that we have, as doing anything more than that would be rather invasive.
Yeah, and it would require updating npm 6 more than we would like, probably, like updating
Yeah,
the
it's
behavior of npm 6.
it's a fair, it would be a fair bit of work for, you know, a version of npm that we're getting every day. We're a little closer to just deprecating.
Okay, cool. I will set that as the answer. Excellent. Thank you, team. So fixing package lock protocol jitter. It's from Tierney, saying one persistent concern I've seen since package lock JSON was introduced was on a fresh npm install, there would occasionally be jitter in the protocol the registry was resolved with. Sometimes it would flip between HTTP and HTTPS. And they had some historical examples of this. And I see an ongoing conversation. So if the package lock is already HTTP, then v7 won't update it, but it will still fetch the tarball over HTTPS.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, like, my question was, like, is there anything actionable?
So
I guess, like,
to be a little more precise in my comment there, if the essentially when we see something that is http://registry, you know, your registry URL, or https:// your registry URL, either way, because we're fetching that from the registry, we fetch it in the way that your registry is configured to work.
Yeah, I think
so.
A good way of saying that, Isaac, is just that we respect or like package lock is never used in isolation of configuration, right?
Right.
We use those two together to make that request happen.
Now, so it would actually be safe to just say, look, anything that's resolving to the registry, we're going to save it as HTTPS, even if your registry is HTTP, because we're going to actually make the fetch over HTTP if that's the case, regardless. But it's like, it ends up being additional churn any way you do it. You know what I mean? Like, if we make it consistent, I guess that's like one-time churn versus multiple times. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'd kind of be fine with whatever, since I think the behavior of NPM is actually correct. It's just a matter of, like, scaring people by them seeing an HTTP URL.
I think at one point we had even discussed not, like, the package lock could potentially not have the protocol in it.
Yeah, I think we discussed just replacing it with a magic string, just like registry URL.
Right. Because it is effectively a magic string anyway. If you change your registry,
Correct.
If you run npm install -- registry equals localhost, anything that starts with that registry.npmjs.org, it'll say, oh, well, you wanted this from the registry, but your registry is this other thing.
This is the confusion for a lot of folks. And I think something that we've been, at least in the last year, I've had this discussion a number of times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we should probably, like, it would be nice to maybe try and address that behavior in npm 8.
Yeah, so the way we would do that is probably add support for some different magic string in npm 7, and then in npm 8 we would start using it, because presumably at npm 8 we no longer care about 6. The reason we didn't do that in npm 7 and we just left it as the default public URL, public registry URL, was that we still needed to work with npm 6 and I think even npm 5, which has its own kind of weird behavior around that.
Okay, is there anything that we should add in addition right now to this discussion?
Well, it's like a month and a half old, and I'm not really sure how big of a concern it still is in NPM 7. I think we need to kind of investigate it. I haven't seen this happen in NPM 7 yet, and I have been using it pretty extensively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I think I saw this kind of jitter happening like when using npm update, but it's something that we fixed later on. Like, so
Yeah.
given that this is very old, like it might have been fixed along the way.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just mark this as the answer then, and we can move on. A shallow clone of Git dependencies. So TrueScatter comes in and says, some Git repos have a ridiculously large history and take forever to clone. Does NPM shallow clone dependencies? If not, it would be nice to have an option for that.
So we shallow clone dependencies that exist that are fetched from Git repository hosts that we know support it. So we know that if something is on GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket, and a couple of others, that they do support shallow cloning. We don't do that if it's just some arbitrary unknown Git host, because shallow cloning is something that has to be supported by the host explicitly. So if it's has some potential to fail, we don't try that. I'd be open to trying a shallow clone, and then if it fails, fall back to a full clone. And that list is configurable within the code that's doing it within Pacoche, but we don't expose that config on the npm CLI. So, yeah.
So should we maybe say, if you're interested in exploring this behavior, we should open an RFC? For the shallow clone first and fall back?
I would just leave the conversation thread open.
Okay, cool. Great. So then shouldn't the results of NPM outdated be inverted? So this person comes and lets us know they are more of a Yarn user and they're used to how it comes out from Yarn. NPM outdated has a yellow for major versions, but red for minor versions.
Yeah, so we have some designs, some design exploration that I think makes this visual representation of like the outdated packages a little bit more clear. So there's probably going to be some improvements in the new year to the UX UI of this output.
Yeah, just to be clear, it's not about major versus minor. It's about you really need to update this and it's within your dependency range, versus there is a new version available, but it's outside your dependency range, so you probably don't want to update it. It's red in the sense of like needs action versus something you should maybe be aware of.
Yeah, but I think what we should say is, we're aware that it can be a bit confusing for some folks as to the way that we're representing it right now.
Mm-hmm.
Looking to solve it in the new year.
All right, so I'll answer that and then we can come back to this one later when we actually have something to point to, unless this is something that we want to add to the roadmap. But I think, for right now, just as like a high level exploration, not on the roadmap, we can come back to this discussion later. Does that seem good to folks?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Then last but not least, can we make NPM link more ergonomic? But this one got answered already by Isaac.
Sure did.
And then let's just double check in case there were any other ones that came in. Just make sure we're looking at it. So make it easier to install from pull request, reduce the noise, work and frustration of CVE reporting, support for browser-based auth. These are all ones we've talked about already.
What's the substitute for unsafe perm in NPM 7?
I think that is a new one. And then let's, okay, yeah, so these are the ones we haven't talked about yet. So flag that installs missing packages. So this is a request about, could npm CI only install what's missing?
Well, if you want a version of CI that only installs what's missing, that's called npm install.
Install. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's literally what npm install does.
Yeah, and it seems like maybe if you want to avoid changes to your package.json and package lock when running install, run npm install no safe. We were talking about before.
If you just run install with no arguments and there's no problems in your package lock,
Yeah.
then npm install with no arguments will not change anything in your package lock or your package JSON.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, CI that adds packages that are missing, like CI is supposed to be a clean install from either missing or empty node modules folder.
Yeah. Cool. So we can move on to the next one here. Substitute for unsafe perm. I found -- unsafe perm became obsolete at npm 7. What should I use instead?
Use for what? I'm not sure what's going on. We no longer drop permissions to nobody when running shell scripts. We just use whoever is the owner of the folder. So if you're installing something in the global space and that folder is owned by root, those scripts will be run by root. Unsafe perm is the default in that case, basically.
Okay. Well, I'll just add that bit that you said, and then you can add some more context here if you have any, but we can wait to find out a little bit more about their use cases. So we got this one also about like ES modules and specifically maybe being able to npm install individual files. I'm happy to cover this one outside of this call because I think that there's a lot more questions to be had here about like, what does this even mean? Where are these things being put? What is the expectation of behavior here? So I think that there's a lot of questions to dig into. I believe that the person who opened this is a contributor to Deno. So I'm guessing that this comes from being interested in better support from NPM for Deno.
Yeah, which is, I think, a great idea. I'm not sure what, I mean, Jordan kind of brings up an interesting problem here because presumably the thing you're installing will have HTTP dependencies, which Node doesn't support. I believe there's an open PR to add support for that.
Yeah, it's being looked into, although it seems like it may be only supported at like the top level of the app and not in transitive dependencies deep in the tree.
I see.
But there's still discussion about like the scope of what something like that would do. Now, with that said, NPM, as we all talked about earlier, or like last week, does not stand for the Node Package Manager. It is something to serve the JavaScript community as a whole. And sometimes even some communities outside of JavaScript, but that's another topic for another day. But I think that there's definitely room to think through this. I think one of the main things that we're talking about here is like a manifest that keeps track of the dependencies that are inside of a repository, as well as like information about it. That's like a great thing within the package lock, for example, with the SHA sums, and then that's something that can be verified. I think a challenge here is about like, well, okay, what does npm install do and how does that get consumed by the platform? So I think like for Deno, for example, there's definitely like another step there that needs to be done. And even for the browser as well, like if we're looking at something like import maps, I think there's some technologies outside of npm that need to exist to kind of hook into whatever npm gets, because all npm really can do is just take this stuff and put it on disk. Does anyone have any other thoughts about this one for right now?
No. There's a lot that has to happen.
Yeah. And then the last one here is we need a way to specify which shell a script is written for. Isaac, I think you've been actively kind of going back and forth on this one, right?
Yeah, this is kind of interesting. I mean, there's some interesting kind of caveats to it if we do let people specify the script shell within package JSON. You know, on the one hand, it's kind of like an engines field. It sort of seems to me to make the most sense there. On the other hand, it makes it very easy to maybe even accidentally publish something that is not, you know, cross-platform in a way that we might not like. I think it's likely safe to say that most NPM developers, most, you know, Node or JavaScript developers on Windows probably do have Bash somewhere on their system, just because Git is so popular and it kind of comes along with Bash. But on the flip side, if you write a PowerShell script and you publish it with, you know, engines shell equals PowerShell, then it's not going to be installable on any non-Windows platform. Another idea is we could just sniff for the presence of Bash if we're on Windows, and if that's there, then, you know, do bash-c rather than cmd, and it's // and other, you know, weird arguments.
I was wondering, and I haven't read through this conversation yet, Isaac, but was the use case that they want the control to dictate the shell, though? That's what, versus us implying or making like assumptions about.
Well, so the issue is they have you know, they're trying to install something and it has some scripts in it that only work with Bash. They don't work with CMD.
Right.
Or
So
Bash, or, you know, born shell like shells. So what they want a way to be able to do is to say, like, what is the script shell that this package's install script should be run with? That does open a number of really interesting questions. It's probably kind of RFC worthy. The biggest one would be, you know, what happens when I have you know, when I set my script shell to like RM and the install script is -rf/, right? Like,
right.
and, you know, we could make it a specific allowed list of shells that you're allowed to use. It might even let us kind of like fail early if we know that something isn't available or it's not on the list. I'm sure there's, you know, tens or at least ones of Fish users who would be thrilled to be able to write their NPM scripts in Fish rather than SH. So yeah, I think it's something worth doing, but it's worth having the, you know, the RFC conversation about.
Cool.
Okay, cool. Great work, y'all. I think that we're probably in a good place to call it for the day. I guess one thing we can check really quickly is look at the YouTube stream and see if we've got any comments at all. I'm gonna ask if folks have any questions. But I'm don't think so. So cool. I'm going to go ahead and stop the stream. To anyone who watched live, thanks for watching. To anyone who's watching later, thanks